If you think you know Henry VIII, the king with 6 wives who created the Church of England, buckle up, because the real Henry VIII was so much worse than anything you will read in a history book. A king so grotesquely fat he needed machinery just to move. A man whose rotten leg wounds smelled so awful that servants ran away and vomited. A king whose own body was breaking down so badly his coffin exploded with gas from his rotting body. Soon you are going to discover the shocking curiosities about Henry VIII that make Game of Thrones look like a children's fairy tale. From his odd eating rituals, through his paranoid safety measures, from his treatment of wives that went beyond execution, to how absolutely grotesque he became in his last years. These are the indisputable facts that will change everything you thought you knew about England's most infamous king. His body was a walking disaster. Let's start with the most shocking truth of all about Henry VIII. By the end of his life, he was, for all intents and purposes, literally a walking corpse. We're talking about a man whose body had become so grotesque that even his own servants were traumatized. Henry's waist measured 54 inches. To put that in perspective, that's bigger than most people's height. He weighed around 400 pounds in an era where the average man was 140. But here's the truly horrific part. It wasn't even just the obesity. His legs were infested with festering open wounds that would never heal. These were not just minor cuts, mind you. These were huge, oozing ulcers with rotting flesh constantly oozing pus. The stench was so bad that courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs over their mouths when coming close to the king. Some historical accounts even claim that the stench could be detected from around 3 rooms away. Servants actually drew straws to see who had to help him dress, because getting too close to the gooey wounds was punishment on its own. But wait. There's worse. Modern medical experts believe Henry sustained a severe traumatic brain injury from a jousting accident in 1536. This was no mere bump on the head. Unconscious for 2 hours was essentially dead in medieval terms. His significant craniofacial injury probably caused profound changes in personality, explaining his transformation from a relatively normal young king to a paranoid, rage-filled egomaniac in his later years. You don't learn this in any history classes you may have attended, but Henry was also likely suffering from a disease called Cushing's syndrome, which explains the sudden weight gain, the mood swings, and the ghastly, hideous, horrible leg ulcers that would not heal. The king's own doctors were so terrified of him, they dare not suggest he was seriously ill at all, because it was considered treason to question the king's health. He was a king who claimed divine right to rule, but in his last years he could not even control his own bodily functions. Henry's royal attendants had to carry special chairs with them everywhere he went, because Henry could not make it from room to room without sometimes having an accident. This was the same man who executed people for looking at him the wrong way. The 2 wives actually had it uglier than you think. Everybody knows Henry VIII had 6 wives and murdered 2 of them. But the truth of what those women went through is so much more than just getting beheaded. We are talking psychological torture that would make today's serial killers jealous. Let's take Anne Boleyn, for example. Before Henry executed her, he decided not only to kill her, but to frame her in such a way that it was almost unbelievable. He tortured Anne's own musician in order to get him to confess under torture that he was an accomplice to an affair with her. Unbelievably, Henry made Anne watch him execute 5 men, including her own brother, for having allegedly slept with her while executing an innocent man simply because of his paranoid fantasies that his wife was unfaithful. Catherine Howard had it even worse, as she was practically a kid when Henry married her, and when he found out about, he didn't simply kill her. He added to the canon law that required all marriages to reveal a sexual history under penalty of treason. Think about how small you have to be to change a whole legal system because you was upset. Your teenage wife wasn't a virgin. The psychological game was the worst part. Henry would shower the wives with gifts of affection one day and then ignore them completely, or even threaten them. The next, Catherine of Aragon spent her final days locked up, pretty much under house arrest, denied the right to contact her daughter Mary, while Henry claimed she was mad, and she died alone, and possibly poisoned writing letters to Henry, who never even read them. Here is something to blow your mind. Henry even forced his wife to sign legal documents, agreeing to a divorce agreement, choc annulment, and poor Anne of Cleves was so terrified of being killed, she agreed to this fake marriage divorcing document just to avoid being executed. She essentially had to act like they were never married and take grace from him for not killing her. And Jane Seymour, the fortunate one who died of natural causes, she died from complications after giving birth to Henry's son. And Henry was already plotting his next wife, before Jane's corpse was even cold. He waited exactly 9 days after Jane's funeral to start arranging his next marriage. He treated people as if they were trash, and the worst part was he had absolutely no option for escape. These women weren't allowed to divorce. Running away meant they would probably be killed. And fighting back meant not only their own execution, but maybe their whole family's annihilation. 3, his dietary habits were flat out ridiculous if you think competitive eating is ridiculous. Now, just wait until you hear about Henry VII. Daily food intake. This dude didn't eat like a king. He ate like he was trying to cause a one-man famine. Henry was taking in an estimated 5,000 calories per day. To put that in perspective, that is more than twice the amount of daily caloric intake than an average-sized active adult male is supposed to eat. And remember that he was basically on his deathbed and barely able to walk at the end of his life. But this was not even the strangest part. It was the amount, but also what he was eating and how he ate it. For example, a typical meal for Henry would consist of an entire roasted pig, several whole roasted chickens, various types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to float a small boat. His kitchen staff prepared over 800 different dishes each day just for his household, with Henry sampling dozens himself. Keep in mind, the royal kitchens employed over 200 people at a time, working around the clock to try to keep pace with Henry's appetite. But this is where it gets interesting. Henry thought certain food had magical properties. He thought if he ate swan, it would make him more graceful, and that eating large quantities of deer would enhance his hunting skills, and ate large quantities of oysters to improve his performance with his wives. So he would also gorge himself on these very specific foods several times a week, like some kind of medieval superfood fanatic. The man also had some of the strangest eating rituals. Every piece of food that entered Henry's mouth was tasted by several servants to check for poison. But wait, there's more! He was so paranoid that he made his food tasters wait 30 minutes after eating, and then he would eat because he wanted to be sure the tasters wouldn't silently drop dead from poison that acted days later. Henry's meals were basically theatrical performances. He also ate in front of many hundreds of quarters, which made meals even longer than can take as long as 4 hours. What a horror show to sit and watch this massive, rotting king eat enough food for a small village, and then to try to act like it was normal, standard royal behavior. You don't learn about this in history classes, but Henry actually banned certain foods from his court, not because they were unhealthy, but because he thought they were beneath him as king, such as turnips and barley. Foods that the common people ate were literally illegal at his table, even though they would have been much better for his health than the mountains of meat and sugar he consumed each day. The crazy part is that Henry was literally falling apart from his diet. Henry kept devouring more and more, feeling that being royal exempted him from the pain of indulgence, for the paranoia that permeated a kingdom. Henry VIII's paranoia was not a typical trust, no one approach, as this man turned his entire kingdom into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators weep. By his final years, Henry was so entirely convinced everyone was plotting against him, he turned royal living into an agonizing nightmare for everyone close to him. Let's begin with sleep. Henry slept with loaded crossbows next to his bed and several daggers under patience atop of the bedding. Henry did not stop there. Henry had armed guards stationed inside his bedroom, and the guards sat quietly and watched Henry while he was sleeping throughout the night. Can you even imagine being so afraid of being murdered by an insurgent that you rely on armed guards to observe your life while you rest? The palace itself became an entire estate of paranoia. Henry ordered thousands of hours consuming secret passage construction on every building he occupied. Henry wanted a passage not for romance or convenience, but for revealing escape routes, in the event an assaulter assaulted him. Peepholes were installed into walls. Technically, he started spying on his own courtiers and listening devices hidden in meeting rooms to record private conversations. But here's where it gets totally insane. Henry created an entire network of spies who spied on his other spies. He had informants spying on his informants, creating this tangled web of surveillance where no one even knew who they could trust. Court life became a psychological horror show where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could literally get you executed. Henry's food paranoia went absolutely insane. He not only had several food tasters, but also required the food to be prepared in completely sealed kitchens with guards guarding every step of the cooking process. The salt, the spices, even the water had to be tested by different people. He was so afraid of being poisoned that eating a simple meal became a military operation. The man even thought his own children were plotting against him. He had spies spying on Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth. His own daughters, he believed, were plotting against him to usurp him. They were children, and he treated them as enemy agents. Right in their own home, Henry's paranoia became so extreme that he began executing people for crimes they had not even committed. Yet he would have someone killed because he had a dream in which they were disloyal, or because someone told him they would be disloyal. The Tower of London was routinely full of people who had committed no crime, only existing nearby when Henry was in one of his paranoid moods. The truly terrifying part is Henry's paranoia was so infectious it spread throughout his entire court. Nobles were spying on each other, servants were betraying their masters for imaginary rewards, and everyone lived in fear of being the next victim of the king's delusional suspicions. 5 deaths could not even halt the chaos, you might think. Henry VII's reign of tyranny would end with his death right wrong. This man was so dedicated to causing havoc that even his cadaver would rage. Havoc. Let's start with his final days. Henry was so gigantic that he couldn't walk, so his servants had to lift him everywhere using wheeled trolley with pulleys and ropes, depending on the task. However, here's the nasty part. His leg wounds had become so infected, pieces of rotten flesh would literally fall from his body while they expertly transported him. The servants had to follow him with cloths to clean up any chunks of decomposing king that fell onto the floors of the palace. His death scene reads as scary novel. Henry's body was swollen and stretched to such an unholy size that it was as shiny as pallor-colored balloon. The smell of decay was so bad, even his doctors, who are used to medieval medical horror, had to leave the room to vomit when he actually died. Nobody wanted to come close enough to check and be sure he was dead. But wait, it gets even worse. Henry's body was so decomposed with gases that when he died, he needed a reinforced coffin. They wrapped his corpse in lead sheets, sealed it in multiple wooden boxes, and thought they had contained the mess. But they were very, very wrong. During his funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle, something absolutely incredible happened. The coffin exploded. The amount of gas from Henry's decomposing body caused so much pressure in the lead lining that it exploded, and rotten royal remains exploded all over the inside of the hearse. The smell was so terrible that the funeral procession had to stop for the servants to clean it, using buckets and rags. Here is a detail that will haunt your dreams. Dogs were reported running around licking up the remains of Henry VIII that had leaked from his coffin onto the road the man who sat on the throne, because he claimed to rule by divine right, simply became dog food on a country highway. Even his burial became a calamity. They had to dig his grave extra wide to accommodate his massive coffin. The ground kept collapsing, and soil was never very sound, which very likely had to do with the plethora of lead that made up the coffin. And in addition to the decomposing flesh, it took more than one try to get the king's body into the earth and stay there. And commotion didn't stop there years later. Stories told of strange sounds and horrible smells coming from the tomb of Henry. Some said it was his ghost. However, historians believe that it was simply more gases escaping from his constantly decomposing remains. You won't read about this in any history classes out there, but in fact Henry's death was so traumatic for every single party. There was more than one servant who handled his body and died within weeks of him dying of what was likely from an infection they got from touching this rotting deceased corpse. So there you go. The true Henry VIII. Not the charming king of pop culture, but a walking disaster whose own body failed him as grandly as he failed everyone around him. A man so ridden with paranoia and gluttony that he turned one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms into his very own horror show. The most powerful man in England became a prisoner in his own decaying body, and even death could not stop his ability to create total anarchy. His legacy is not just the Church of England or his 6 wives, it is a masterclass in how absolute power can turn a human being into something genuinely monstrous. If these unsettling royal facts had you doubting everything you thought you knew about history, maybe hit that subscribe button, because I have many more horrific truths that history textbooks conveniently leave out. And trust me, you haven't heard anything yet.